Good day, future educators. It's another day for another fun-filled learning adventure all about teaching and learning. For today, we'll be learning all about guidelines in writing standards, specifically on its third step, which is identifying the criteria for the task. This is Group 6. Yours truly, JEDDAH PUGOY, together with Jenny PUYOT, MARYVIC PUYOT, and Leslie Maranga, your reporters for today. So before we begin, let us first do a recap altogether. Assessment plays an important role in the process of learning and motivation, wherein, as future educators, we are very much aware that the nature of assessment is to assess the students' learning as to what is the extent of how they learn. So when we say the extent of the students' learning, this simply pertains to how far they have learned according to a series of discussions and engagement that we are able to do inside the four walls of the classroom, wherein, through assessment, educators are able to engage students in activities that is of relevance to the real world, that further enhances their knowledge, at the same time enriches their skills. Wherein, in creating assessment, educators need to set certain standards. So, future educators, what are standards? So why is there a need for us to set certain standards whenever we are handling students? Simply because as students, they are expected to deliver outcomes that is according to what is expected of them in a certain topic. So, what is the importance of setting standards? So, why is setting standards important? So, in general, setting standards, teachers can identify the skills that matter most, can evaluate student work fairly, can give feedback to students that is helpful and actionable, and can use data to revise upcoming lessons to meet their students' needs. So through standards and imposing standards, educators are able to follow up on their students as to how far they have gone with their learning. So next. So here are the guidelines in writing standards. So this was previously mentioned by previous reporters. So according to previous reporters, in writing guidelines for standards, the first thing you need to do is to choose a certain standard you want to achieve. Naturally, this is very understandable that if you are an educator, you have to set standards that is attainable and achievable according to the capabilities of your students. So next, Step 2 is to select an authentic task. Why? Because whenever you set standards, it is feasible that as educators, you should be able to come up with an engagement or a task that students will be able to deliver their capabilities. Now, our highlight for today is the third step, which is to identify the criteria for the task. But before we further begin as to what is criteria, ladies and gentlemen, can you give me an idea as to what criteria is? Very good. So criteria can be that it is a collection of information. Criteria can also be a set of standards imposed towards students. So now, what is a criteria in general? So a criteria in general, students, ladies and gentlemen, is an assessment criteria that provides students such as ourselves with information about the qualities, characteristics, and aspects of an assessment task that will be used to measure the attainment of each learning outcome. So to give an example, you are a teacher and you are teaching a grade 1 class, and the subject that you are teaching is mathematics. So the standard and criteria that you have set is for grade 1 students to be able to count from 1 to 20. So how do you assess their learning? So the criteria that you will be able to come up for such engagement to assess their learning is, how about you allow them to count numbers 1 to 20 either individually or it can be through a group, depending on how capable your students are able to deliver the certain activity. So next. So in order for us to know as to what is a criteria, flashed on the screen is an example of a criteria, wherein what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you see the picture replicated on the screen, ladies and gentlemen? Very good. Some of you have answered that what you see is a rubric. Yes, the example is a rubric. But why do you think that is of relevance to what I am discussing, which is a criteria? Well, the criteria, ladies and gentlemen, is part of the rubric. As you can see on the blue highlighted part on the rubric, that is expected criteria for this activity. So as you can see, this is a rubric for a mathematics class, and the criteria imposed in this rubric is to deliver response given with no mathematical errors in the problem 1, while in problem 2, read all together, detailed response given no mathematical errors. So clearly, the criteria set for such educational session is for students to give a detailed response with no mathematical errors. So now that we know as to what is a criteria, let us know as to what are the characteristics of a good criteria. So now, in order for us to know, let us ask Teacher Jenny to expound further as to what we have already known.
Okay, so based on the example shown and discussed by JEDDAH earlier, now let us tackle about the characteristics of a good criteria. But before that, why is it important for us to know or to be aware of the characteristics of a good criteria? It's because this criteria will serve as a guide for us in crafting our own criteria after this lesson. So, we have here the 5 characteristics of a good criteria. First, we have here, a good criteria should be clearly stated. So that means it is very understandable that the criteria should be clearly stated. It must not be ambiguous, it should be specific. So kinahanglan masabtan siya sayon sa mga bata. And next one, we have there, a good criteria should be brief. So kinahanglan mubo siya. The criteria must be written briefly. So, nakakita na ba mo mga criteria nga kanang tag-as or very long, di ba? Wala. So, that is one of the characteristic of a good criteria. Kinahanglan mo buora siya. It should be brief. And we have the third one, characteristics of a good criteria is observable. A good criteria must be observable. So, meaning, the criteria or the standard you set for your students is doable in their part. Kaya nga naman, we are handling elementary students and that we should pose standards or expectations that are observable, that are doable on their part. Kinahanglan makuha sa ilang capacity or will fit to their level of ability or capacity. And the next one is a good criteria must have a statement of behavior, of course. Dili kay mo butang nakadirag criteria lang. There should be clear statements that will enable the students or to have a clear perception kung unsa ilahang buhaton. And the last one we have there that a good criteria must be written in language which students could understand, of course. So, in crafting a criteria, it should be that the language you employ in crafting the criteria is understandable sa mga estudyante. Kaya nga naman, the criteria is for the students. And how can students understand or do or meet the criteria you set if your criteria is not understandable? So, meaning, in crafting the criteria, you should use mga simple words, basic words. Dili siya mga difficult words because your students are elementary grades. Kinahanglan nga mo level pud sa ilahang ability or sa ilahang panabot. Okay, so, nakuha na ang characteristics sa good criteria. So, before we proceed, let us enumerate again the 5 characteristics of a good criteria. Again, it should be clearly stated, it should be brief, it should be observable, there should be statement of behavior, and the language you use in writing the criteria must be understandable on the student's part. So, the next one is, we as future educators, we have to keep in mind that in crafting a criteria, although the criteria can be understandably related to another, there should not be too much overlap between them. So, most of criteria have similarities. They are somewhat like related to each other, but we also have to know that in every criteria, they serve different purpose. Just like, for example, the examples we have here. First one, we have the criteria of interpret the data. And the next one is draw a conclusion from the data. So as what we have observed, these two somewhat like overlap. No, they have similarities or they are related. But if we are going to analyze this criteria, when we say interpret the data, that is kanang i-interpret nimo ang i-interpret ang data, i-analyze, subtune ang data. And the second criteria is draw a conclusion from the data. So when we say draw a conclusion, that means that the students makes or conclude information based on their interpretation about the data. So, as what I've said, they overlap, they are related, but they have different purpose or they have meaning. The first one, they interpret, and the second one, they draw a conclusion. And the next thing that we should keep in mind is another overlap occurs when one criterion is a subset of another criterion. So, meaning if the previous one is the two criterion is related to each other, then they have somewhat like different, pero naa sila quite differences. In this criteria, they also have their differences and they also serve different purpose. Naa siya lain-lain nga purpose. But we have here the subset. So when you say subset, mura siya kanang from this general idea, naa siya subset. Example, the presenter keeps the audience attention. The second criteria, the presenter makes eye contact with the audience. So still, these two have similarities. Let's analyze the two examples. With the first one, we say presenter keeps the audience attention, meaning the presenter still holds the audience attention. Ang attention sa audience na aghapon sa presentation sa presenters. The second one, the presenter makes eye contact with the audience. Muna siya subset sa first nga criterion because these two criterion still have something to do with the audience. Part gapon ang audience. Only that in the first criterion, it talks about the attention of the audience. And the second one is somewhat like a subset of the first one, which means that the presenter makes eye contact with the audience. Did you understand? Okay, then now let's proceed. So, future educators, let us also take note that alike standards, pareha sa standards, ang criteria should also be shared to students before they begin a task so that they are aware of the teacher's expectations and have a clear sense of what good performance should look like. So we are going to emphasize the two purpose here of the criterion. It's not just for the teacher, but it's also for the students. Let us tackle first the teacher. So what is the purpose of criteria for teachers? It is for the teachers to deliver it is a way for teacher nga to deliver their kanang expectations ba nga mao ni ang this is what they expected to be performed by the students. So that is the purpose of criterion for the teachers. Another one, we have here a clear sense of what good performance should look like. So that is can also be for the purpose for the students for them to be able to know that mao din ni kinahanglan mong buhaton. So in that way, the purpose of criterion for the students will serve as their guide or guide in making their activity or in crafting their activity or in performing. So again, the criteria must be shared to the students before they begin a task because the criteria will serve a guide for the students in making the activity. So now that we already know what is criteria and what are the characteristics of a good criteria, let us now expand our knowledge through the help of Leslie Maranga.
So now, as a future educator,
for us to create a good criterion or criteria, let's ask ourselves first by these two questions. So first, what does good performance on this task look like? So as a future educator, before we create a criteria for evaluating, we must look first what will be happen of the performance of our students if ma-attain ba nila or ma-met ba nila ang standards nga ato ang gusto nga makuan sa ilahang performances. So as a future educator, we have to set a good standard of creating a criteria so that our students will give us back a good performances. Next question. How will I know they did a good job on this task? So, saan man na ito pagkahibaw if kanang nindot bang ilang performances? So of course, if nindot ilang performances, makaingon jud ta nga na-attain nila or na-met nila ang standards of criteria nga ako ang gihimo para sa ilang performances. So now, do take note that in using a criteria in evaluating a task, make sure that students met the expected standards. So in making criteria in evaluating, we will have to make sure as a future educator or as a teacher in the future nga dapat ang ato ang criteria nga gihimo is ma-attain ang standards or ma-met ang standards sa mga estudyante sa ang ma-met sa students ang standards nga ato ang gihimo para sa ilang mga performances. So now let's look for the example. First is example number 1 is the students will conduct banking transactions. So we all know that banking transaction, this is the money that we moved in or out in our bank account. So in relating sa teaching banking transaction, this is the teacher assigned the students to assess the standards. Assess the standards was to make deposits, withdraw, or cash check at the bank, or in a simplest mean, ang bank transition, this is the standards of the teacher nga gusto niya ma-attain or ma-met sa iyang mga estudyante. So what to do? In order to identify the criterion for good performances in the given task, the teacher will come up with essential characteristics for successful completion of the task. So here are the 7 characteristics in making or in completion of the task. So, but before I will read the 7 characteristics. Let me kanang explain first that through having a kanang chosen criteria through having a chosen standard, teachers are able to come up with a good certain criteria that will enable students to perform the certain task, wherein teachers, such as the example, the teacher expect his or her learners to do the following series of activities in order to accomplish the certain task given by the teachers, wherein in order to students to achieve and attain the given standard, first and foremost thing to do is they have to select needed form, which is they have to choose what is deposit bar or withdrawal. Then next is fill in the necessary information. Next is third is endorses check. Fourth is locates open letter. Fifth is states type of transaction. Sixth is counts money to deposit to teller. 7 is puts received money in wallet. So those are the 7 characteristics in making a successful completion of the task. So if the students meet this criteria, then they will perform well of the task given, or they met the standards given by the teachers, or at least they provided some evidences of meeting the standards. So those are the characteristics and characteristics in successful completion of the task. So now, for us to learn more about how in making a good criterion, let's now proceed to the guidelines in making criteria. So that is to be discussed by teacher MARYVIC.
So, okay, how many criteria do you need for a task? That is the question that we need to answer as we go along on my report. So, future educator, in making assessment, is it possible to use one criteria? Or is it possible to use two or more criteria? What is your opinion about that? Can you at least give me? Yes, is it possible to use one criteria? But however, it is also possible to use two or more criteria as long as it is inclined and appropriate to your students' capabilities. So, here are a few guidelines that we need to remember as we craft our assessment or we make our criteria into a certain task. So, first guideline, kindly read all together. So, limit the number of criteria. Why we need to limit the number of criteria? Because assessment is more feasible and meaningful if we will focus more on the characteristics of the task. We should not kanang make more criteria nga dili na sad siya kanang appropriate sa task. Gets? Keep it essential to the elements of the task. Why we need to keep it essential? For example, you are teaching mathematics. So we all know that teaching mathematics focuses more on problem solving. So do not include criteria that involves grammar, checking of spelling. No, we should not include that into our criteria. But rather, we must focus more on the subject itself. And understand? So now, let's proceed to the second guideline. Kindly read all together. Yes. The second guideline states that you do not have to assess everything on every task. Why? Because it is clear to your students that you expect something from them out of the criteria that you make for a particular task. Gets? Now, let's move on to the last guideline. All together, kindly read. So, the last guideline states that smaller, less significant tasks typically requires fewer criteria. So, obviously, why? Because smaller tasks need fewer criteria. Kailangan naman sad nga kanang imong tagaan og maghatag kag daghang criteria kung ang imong gipabuhat is kanang gaan ra. So you should give them at least three criteria is enough for them to measure their kanang capabilities.
Thank you, MARYVIC. So, ladies and gentlemen, future educators, here is a reminder. Never hesitate to ask yourself, ask your students, and ask your colleagues. So, that marks the end of this educational session. This have been JEDDAH PUGOY together with Jenny PUYOT, MARYVIC PUYOT, and Leslie Maranga, your reporters for today. See you in our next educational session. Bye!